Hey, hello everyone. 22 December, weekly Marx. We'll look a little bit at something on the new version of Capital, Volume 1, Princeton University Press version, the new translation by the Pauls. And it is about crisis in that particular sense because I was staring at some other stuff. For example, the dynamic pivot mechanism. And I got there sort of at uh, because I was staring further at a problem in both rent theory and I know you care all about this, but a an argument or a series of differences between Alfred Marshall and some guy named Fetter, uh, the Frank Fetter. Uh, so I got there from a apparently Alfred Marshall, the economist working at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, was annoyed by Frank Fetter's response to a thing that he'd written on rent and quasi-rent, and is a little thin-skinned. So it in sort of a passive-aggressive fashion, Marshall did change stuff in his writing according to Fetter's critique, but he sort of never admits it. I mean, in a kind of bigger way. And someone looking at Alfred Marshall's papers, correspondence, noted that he spent a fair amount of time doing annotations on various versions that Fetter had sort of commented on. Unfortunately, uh, I think Fetter did not fare well from this. Fetter is not, we don't mention Fetter in the literature, whereas Marshall has given us many things, including things about that are important for neoclassical economics. Now, I know that doesn't seem horribly important, but Marshallian logic really does pervade contemporary economic neoclassical theory. And so it may be just looking at sort of a brief little marginal moment, but Fetter was very concerned and thought that Marshall had contradicted himself. And so Alfred Marshall's theory of rent was a watershed moment in economics, and his ideas on the subject continue to positively and negatively influence economists and social scientists well into the 21st century. Far less well known is the scathing critique of Marshall's theory published by Frank Fetter in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, one of the premier journals. Fetter identified several concepts of rent in Marshall's work that he attacked as contradictory, arguing that Marshall embraced classical errors while still attempting to emancipate himself from them. Marshall responded by adding a critical note on Fetter to the fifth edition of his Principles of 1907, but otherwise showed little public interest in reply. However, archival evidence reveals that both Marshall and Fetter took this dispute seriously and personally, and that they continued to debate each other at a distance for several decades. This paper brings to light previously unknown archival sources, including unpublished notes, correspondence, and manuscripts, to tell the full story of their controversy. Doing so sheds new light on the work of both men and adds in several ways to our understanding of the early history of neoclassical economics, to the development of theory of rent, and of theoretical paths not taken. And so, if you believe in sort of presence and absence of certain ideas, this is useful in the sense that it forces some of us to look at other side literature. That is, Alfred Marshall did look at Marx, agreed with social. It was Marshall agreed sort of with socialism. Um, at a certain moment in the 19th century, you didn't get in trouble if you were talking about socialism, so that was important. But the fundamental issue, of course, uh, what Feder was saying is, Marshall didn't let go of certain fundamental concepts, the so-called old rent theory, the Ricardo's theory, and he didn't sort of go completely past it. He sort of still relied on it. So that was Feder's point, and being sort of annoying, I suppose, to Marshall. Marshall uh, continued on, yet did correct it, yet was annoyed by Feder, and this is sort of unfortunately why Feder is not famous, and Marshall is, because of sort of the positioning of his original ideas. I suppose Feder wasn't a careerist and got major text out there. Anyway, the debate represents an important step in the development of rent theory, mainly its generalization from the narrow classical notion of a return to agricultural land to the wider idea of a return to any uniquely scarce resource. And this promotes the idea of a kind of scarcity theory on the issue of quasi-rent. But the fact is, quasi-rent is not finite in that sense. If you use it to apply to a variety of things like information, for example, it's not as fixed, right? Even though massive attempts like an intellectual property, et cetera, you try and constrain that, um, patents it all. And so there is a conventional view, and even today, however, discussions and debates about rent still bear Marshall's imprint. The idea of rent as a surplus or a differential or as an income deriving from land, natural resources, rare skills, or from any asset with an inelastic supply. The elastic and elasticity argument is a mathematical one, 0 to whatever, and all implicitly draw on Marshall's account. Feder's critique was part of a larger effort to shunt neoclassical rent theory onto a thoroughly subjectivist track, an effort that ultimately failed for several reasons. In England, a major obstacle is Marshall's entrenched prestige in economics. Likewise, in the USA, the influence of Tausig's principles and a more general climate of eclecticism and caution in economics textbooks, which often shied away from major controversy or from fully overturning established doctrines, also helped to stifle the emergence of more radical theoretical views. As a result, rent theory in the 20th and 21st century still exhibits a strong Marshallian influence, including hints of classical ideas. The paper is organized as follows. Section 2 provides, I'm not going to read the whole paper, provides an overview of the Marshall-Feder dispute, introduces unpublished archival materials that are explored in subsequent sections. Section 3 compares Feder's published criticisms to Marshall's annotations written in his copy of Feder's article. Thousands of annotations, and reveals some previously overlooked ways in which Marshall revised later editions to reply to those critiques. Section 4 considers some remarks about the dispute that Marshall made to Winthrop Daniels at a conference in 1907. Section 5 turns to Feder's own reflections following Marshall's death. Section 6 concludes by discussing the insights this debate offers to the history of economic thought and hints at its relevance for some contemporary research on rent in economics and in other disciplines. And so this goes back to discussions on Henry George and rent and blah, 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 blah. There is a timeline for this, and the article does have all kinds of stuff, so there's literally 40 some odd years of fiddling around with this that Feder doesn't quite cop to at some moment. And let me get to the conclusion so it becomes easier for people to sort of think about. Good footnotes, etc. The question, of course, is the shift of perspective, at least according to Feder, the idea of changing from money cost to real cost. The undertaker's cost, that is the person who undertakes the thing, and the owner, as opposed to the undertaker, the person who manipulates the stuff. So it is a difference between a kind of subjective individual point of view and a collective sort of point of view. So that's kind of going on. Conclusion. Marshall's theory of rent was a watershed moment in economics, but it did not go unchallenged. Instead, a variety of previously unknown source material revealed the true nature of Marshall's defensivist theory against attacks from Fetter. Revisiting this exchange offers insight into both Marshall the man and Marshall the scholar, yet it also provides suggestions for contemporary work in the theory of rent and its applications. First, on a personal level, the archival materials reveal how Marshall reacted to criticism publicly and privately. They support the idea that he could take it personally, but also that he was charitable and eager to clear up misunderstandings. In his annotations, his discussion with Jenks, his brief letter to Fetter, and his interaction with Winthrop Daniels all support this view. None of these sources are known or discussed in any study of Marshall's life or work of which I am aware. Second, on a professional level, I have shown that the dispute over the rent concept was far more important for Marshall than scholars have realized. Marshall took the time to go through Fetter's critique line by line to the point that he ended up annotating it more than any other article in his enormous periodical collection. Furthermore, many of the revisions to the chapters on rent in the fifth edition of the Principles can be traced to Marshall's reactions to Fetter. In fact, Fetter's critique was so strong that Marshall drastically reorganized the discussion of rent in later editions, abandoning the fourth edition structure considered by some to be his best. Third, this discussion is relevant for modern economists utilizing Fetter's ideas, those interested in Marshall. It is fair to say that while Marshall continues to rank among the most famous economists of all time, Fetter's reputation following his death in 1949 sank like a meteoric stone. Nevertheless, he continues to inspire new research, especially amongst contemporary Austrian economists who share his subjectivist and anti-Marshallian perspective and often embrace his theory of rent. Yes, the Austrians, that's, everybody goes down that road for a while and then suddenly decides, well, it's just rationalizing what capitalists want. But, some stay there, some actually return to other matters, to reality. The present paper has something to offer this group as well. In particular, it shows more clearly how Marshall engaged with Austrian-style criticisms of his work. This is particularly important because rent theory in subjectivist Austrian economics was and is a relatively overlooked topic that usually takes a back seat to debates about capital interest and other factors and factor incomes. The present study opens up a new front for engagement between the two traditions as well as with mainstream economics. Fourth, the Marshall-Fetter dispute carries valuable lessons and opportunities for economists with a general interest in rent, land, and related topics. For example, land value taxation. Rent theory has undergone significant changes since the Marshall-Fetter controversy, but Marshall's approach has proven deeply influential in modern economics, both positively and negatively. The Marshall-Fetter debate took place at a theoretical crossroads, as economists were moving away from classical theory and groping for more modern alternatives. This is the promise of Marshall's work, which presented rent as a more general phenomenon rather than a return to a specific factor, like land, for example. Yet Fetter argues that this promise was not fulfilled because Marshall inconsistently kept a foot in each camp. How cautious. Providing multiple accounts of rent that were individually unsatisfactory and mutually contradictory, and they're both built on and rejected classical ways. As a result of Marshall's complex approach, for decades after his death, economists were able to claim that the rent concept remained confused and controversial, and that only much later was the shift to a new concept completed. Needless to say, one influenced by neo-Ricardians and Marxists. This confusion about the different meanings of rent continues to this day in economics as well as neighboring disciplines like strategic management. Within this broader history and controversy, Fetter's positive view of rent represents a road not taken, although some critics have claimed that he disparaged the classics without providing an alternative. This is mistaken, as he did develop an original theory of rent across 2 textbooks and several articles. A full account of this theory and its implications is beyond the scope of this paper, but is worth a brief comment. Fetter argued that rent should be conceived as the unit price per period time for the use of any productive factor. In other words, rent is, quote, the amount paid by contract for the use of the durative, that is, separable uses of more or less durable agent, the use bearer, entrusted by an owner to a borrower for a limited period to be returned in equally good condition, except for ordinary wear and tear. This is consistent with the etymology of the word rent and avoids the problems Fetter ascribes to classical and early neoclassical views while maintaining the benefits of a generalized concept to stand in as an alternative to Marshall's. Moreover, it has the added benefit of fitting well with colloquial understandings of rent as simply the renting out of a productive asset. It thus helps bridge the gap between academic jargon and public understanding. Fetter's theory was only much later recognized in modern accounts of production and distribution, but has more recently been applied in areas like strategic management. After a century or more, it is now positioned to produce a fruitful, non-mainstream contribution to theory. It also has a role to play in ongoing efforts to better define economic rents, free them from classical or neoclassical baggage, and make them fit for addressing modern challenges such as rent seeking and global wealth inequities. So it gets us all the way to Mazzucato et al. So, it really is covering the gamut here. So that's the conclusion for our little diversion into Marshall versus Fetter. And, it's a good example of, academic work, going in there, looking at the archives, trying to sort of really examine a person's work, and particularly the unpublished stuff. And particularly the, whatever X thousand annotations. Now, why is this useful for Marx? It is a way, rent troubles could signify, among many other things, the issue of crisis that goes on. These are matters that, things that signify crisis. And raising rent is certainly one of them. It's inflationary, but also signifies a certain concentration of intangible assets, the same kinds of things that went on in 2007 through 9. The issue of, problem of securitizing things, or particularly in types of assets that relate to, for example, mortgages, subprime et al. So we go to the text itself, that is to look at how Marx talks about crisis, and he does talk about it more on the money side, but it is a useful for where the discourse currently is. So there's a brief section that I can read on the change in thinking about money from chapter 3, volume 1, the new translation. The notes that talk about the sudden transformation of the credit system into a monetary system adds theoretical dismay to the actually existing panic, and the agents of the circulation process and the agents of the circulation process are overawed by the impenetrable mystery surrounding their own relations. The poor stand still because the rich have no money to employ them, though they have the same land and hands to provide victuals, victuals, and clothes as ever they had, which is the true riches of a nation and not the money. So it's just interesting that Marx is going on in terms of the notes. Now, the commentary on this is also useful because it is a time of crisis, and rents are one of many signifiers of the problem. One great advantage, this is the commentary from the editors on volume 1. So this is actually the meat of why retranslate Marx in the 21st century. One great advantage of a system put together from many disparate kinds of actors with disparate motives and goals is that it is adaptable. It can pull together what doesn't naturally fit together. A disadvantage of such an assemblage is that it holds together all the conflicting forces by force. It can disintegrate, sometimes also with force. Such partial or total disintegrations calls crises. Europe and the United States went through economic crisis after economic crisis in the 19th century. One example could be the American Civil War did change, cotton, uh, cotton consumption and or cotton production, its modification and use in England, for example. A disadvantage such partial or total disintegrations Marx calls crises. Europe and the United States went through crisis after crisis in the 19th century. The English crisis of circulation of 1809 to 11, a collapse due to speculation in 1819, the Panic of 1825, in which the Bank of England nearly failed, the global panic of 1837, centered in the United States and Britain, the Anglo-French Panic of 1847, and so on. An important innovation in Marx's theory of the capital system is to consider crises as endemic to the system rather than as historical accidents. Groups with contradicting purposes, if the force holding together falters, may spring apart. Some crises are smaller, such as the crisis of circulation indicated here. When circulation slows and commodities can't be sold in a timely manner, capital won't flow back to production fast enough to keep the machines running. A stoppage occurs, money is lost, and a business or an entire industry may go under, with concomitant suffering by workers. Some crises are larger and apply to the whole system. As a historical organism, the last example of this is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which we've talked about before, which Marx presents directly in Volume 3, Part 3 of Capital. In brief, this law of a tendency states that industrial economies inevitably occupy their wealth in more and more fixed capital, such as machinery, i.e., technology. And because the capital gets trapped in this way, the rate of profit will tend to fall. The validity of this law has been much disputed, and some commentators consider it refuted definitively, but its implications for the critique of political economy are clear. Marx is looking for an innate and permanent tendency for the system to fall under its own weight, which is the controversy, of course. And we can see even as further notations by Marx, for example, reveal some of these kinds of trade-offs. During the cotton crisis caused by this is Marx's note 36 in chapter 13. During the cotton crisis caused by the American Civil War, the English government sent Dr. Edward Smith to Lancashire, Cheshire, and other places, with the assignment being to examine the health conditions of cotton workers. He reported that with regard to hygiene, the crisis had quite a few advantages, beyond the fact that workers were expelled from the factory atmosphere. Female workers now had enough time to breastfeed their children instead of poisoning them with Godfrey's cordial. They also gained enough time to learn how to cook. Unfortunately, though, they became skilled in the art of cooking at a moment when they had nothing to eat. But one can see here how, for the sake of its self-valorization, capital takes away the time a family needs for consumption. The crisis was also made use of to teach workers' daughters how to sew. This was done in sewing schools. It took an American Revolution and a world crisis for girl workers who spin for the whole world to learn how to sew. And needless to say, you can see the implications of that for a whole bunch of other literature. So there's further comments on this, and you know, I was interested in this because for the obvious reasons, I hope, and that you can see that other things need to be worked through. One example would be questions about, as I was noting from yesterday, about the glossary for Hanel and Albert's book about mechanisms that they were sort of obsessing about. More interestingly, the idea of a pivot mechanism, which is a concept from control theory. That is the idea of, you know, that that businesses should be engineered to work, with a certain type of optimizable control. And so there's a literature on dynamic pivot mechanisms, which, if you want to indulge the metaphor, is a useful one for talking about certain transformations from a Marxist point of view. So I'll just read the abstract to spare you the headache that you're probably already getting. We consider truthful implementation of the socially efficient allocation in an independent private value environment in which agents receive private information over time. We propose suitable generalization of the pivot mechanism based on the marginal contribution of each agent. See that Marshallian elements here. In the dynamic pivot mechanism, the ex post incentive and ex post participation constraints are satisfied for all agents after all histories. In an environment with diverse preferences, is the unique mechanism satisfying ex post incentive, ex post participation, and efficient exit conditions. We've developed the dynamic pivot mechanism in detail for a repeated auction of a single object in which each bidder learns over time her true valuation of the object. The dynamic pivot mechanism here is equivalent to a modified second price auction. Without going too far, we can talk about eBay and Etsy and a variety of other things. Now, Gemini weighs in on this. If you try to sort of mush things together and get the large language model to sort of cope with it. And so it sort of punts. While Marx didn't explicitly use the term dynamic pivot mechanisms, surely not, some of his ideas might have some conceptual overlap. That is, in self-regulation of the market, Marx recognized that capitalist market has a tendency towards self-regulation, driven by competition and the pursuit of profit, all you libertarians out there. This could be seen as a type of mechanism, quote unquote, that adjusts the behavior of individual capitalists. Greed is good. Crises as turning points. Marx argued that capitalist economies are prone to crises which can act as pivots that disrupt the existing order and potentially lead to new forms of economic organization. So in one little sentence here, we see, shifts among modes of production and forces of production argument, and a bunch of other stuff there. Now, what this led me to, which is an article I did need to read, because it was a basis for Basu up at UMass moving along in a certain idea of rent theory applied to the Indian economy. And the source of that commentary, I don't know if Das is a student of Basu's, but anyway, there's a thing, an article by Debarshi Das on a model of Marxist rent theory applied primarily to Indian agriculture. You'll note I keep making that little linguistic error. In the Marxist framework, the theory of rent is central to the understanding of the production of surplus value in agriculture as well as its distribution. Discussion of rents of various kinds occupies a substantial portion of the third volume of Capital. Yet Marx's rent theory has received fewer comments and developments by followers and critics alike than other major parts of his system. That's Ernst Mandel. This is puzzling. Developing economies like India have a vast agricultural sector providing livelihood to a large segment of the population. These countries do not lack the presence of political movements and animated by the Marxist vision. Yes. Yet one does not find many attempts to understand their agrarian economy by deploying Marxist rent theory. Now, there can be two possible reasons for this absence. First, it's been observed that the rent theory is one of the most difficult parts of Marxist economics. There have been conflicting claims over interpretations of his theory as well. See, there's Ben Fine again. This signals an analytic terrain whose contours are disputed. Not surprisingly, Few's records have been built on the uncertain ground. The second reason is the assumption of the framework. The first chapter of Rent in Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 37, made it clear that the discussion was applicable to an agrarian economy where the capitalist mode of production has established itself. This would preclude many of today's third world countries. For instance, agricultural production of India is characterized by production relations which can scarcely be called capitalist. The classical pattern of agrarian capitalism that took shape in England was characterized by the triad of landowning rent earner, tenant, capitalist, farmer, and wage earning agricultural worker. Such is not the defining feature of Indian agriculture. One purpose in this chapter is to address this gap, and et cetera, et cetera. Uh, it's more specific about India, but there's its introduction to the application or sort of reinterpretation of Marxian rent theory, particularly on the issue of agriculture. And of course, this relates to, driving us back to the Ricardian, neo-Ricardian kind of things, and actually quite recently important considering the recent turmoil in Indian agriculture. So that it all kind of fits together in a somewhat useful way. Not that I'm going to do a whole thing on Indian agriculture, but it does suggest that it is useful, even though people that it runs contrary to switching arguments. In other words, switching arguments work better for capitalism and in financialized ways and not in agricultural ways. It doesn't mean that they both don't work at the same time, because they clearly do. And in the American context, to just shift it's not like Indian agriculture in that sense, although it is at another level. But anyway, that's for another conversation. You could say that farm subsidies have this other kind of effect that are important for the assessment of certain elements and ultimately certain crises. And you could even identify the trade war that was attempted in the Trump first term, where he screws it up and has to move $12 billion to prop up or to resubsidize the agricultural sector, among other industries, because he screws up. And if you believed that that was a screw up, you shouldn't have voted for Trump. But anyway, that's another this time around. Anyway, that's sort of the end of my yammering here, because I've reached the end of my time. Let's see if there are any comments or brickbats or whatever. Yes, indeed, Feder and Frankfurter. Frankenfurter. What a nice meal, and I'm hungry. And yes, there are a lot of lefties in that room. It takes another crisis to make people learn how to grow vegetables. Yes, indeed. Very important. So thank you very much for that. Since I reached the end of my time and at the top of the hour, Star Trek, The Next Generation, with Professor John, I will stop so people can return to at least a 45-minute moment of